And when we talk about kinds of obligations, we have these classifications. We have the primary classification. We have these 6. Okay? Nakasulat yun siya dito sa Civil Code. In fact, naaga ni siya a specific section for these following kinds of obligations. The first section, or section 1, talks about pure and conditional obligations. The next talks about obligations with a period, alternative and facultative, joint and solidary, divisible and indivisible obligations with a penal clause. Actually, if you are going to look at these kinds of obligations, you will have an idea already. Pure, okay? So, pure, tinuod yun, genuine. Conditional, 50-50, okay? Pag maingon ta og divisible, pwede siyang ma-divide. Pag sinabi natin indivisible, hindi siya pwedeng i-divide. So, things like that. Actually, dili po ta maglisod og sabot kung unsa ang kaning mga terms. But then, we are going to dig deeper unsa man ang mga provisions nga applicable sa kaning mga obligations. And the secondary classification still in the Civil Code, but not wala gyud sila specifically gibuhatan og isa gyud ka section sa ato ang Civil Code, but as we go along ato ra gihapon sila nga ma-encounter. Example, unilateral and bilateral, and I think we had an overview of this last time, di ba? Ato naman ning nahisgutan kaning one-sided ug ang mutual. We also talked about real and personal obligation to give and to do or not to do, right? Determinate and generic. We also talked about hindi pa pala tayo nag-discuss about natural, but we have an overview. For example, sa natural obligation, kana bang muhatag ka out of utang na loob. Okay? Muhatag ka not because you are bounded, but because siguro sa imong konsensya or siguro gusto lang gyud ka nga mubawi. Okay? Sa obligation or sa kung unsa man iyang gipakita sa imuha before. So that's natural. Whereas civil, obligation yun na nimo. Kung di na nimo buhaton, then that could be a ground for civil liability. Okay? And then we have legal, conventional, and penal. So these are actually secondary classifications. So pag-uusapan po natin is itong primary classification. And I think this afternoon we could talk about A and B, or sections 1 and 2 under the Civil Code, pure and conditional, and then obligations with a period. So let's begin. When we talk about pure and conditional obligations, we are tackling Articles 1179 to Article 1192. Okay, let's start with defining what a pure obligation is. First, this obligation is not subject to any condition. Kaya nga siya sinabi ng pure. Okay? Walay 50-50 diri kung madayon ba or dili ang obligation. So, since hindi siya subject to any condition, that means it is demandable at once. Okay? No specific date for its fulfillment. So, walang condition, wala ding term, or walang period. Pag sinabi nating term or period, yung date, okay, or unsa ba katasa or kadugaya bago ma-extinguish or mawala ang obligation, or unsa ba kadugaya bago nimo hulaton nga mag-arise ang obligation. So no specific date for its fulfillment. So since walang condition, hindi nyo din pinag-usapan kung kailan gagawin, kailan mag-a-arise ang obligation. That means it should be demandable immediately. Pag sinabi nating demandable at once, that's demandable immediately. Agad-agad, pwede mo nang i-compel ang debtor na gawin ang obligation niya agad-agad. Pwede mo na ding i-compel si creditor na tanggapin ang performance ng obligation. For example, Sam obliges himself to pay 1,000 to Pia. Walang kondisyon. Wala ding date kung kailan gagawin. That means from the time that they agreed na magbabayad si Sam ng 1,000 to Pia, it could be demandable immediately. Okay, that's pure obligation. Walang keme-keme, bayad agad. Walang keme-keme, tanggapin mo na agad. Okay? Whereas a conditional obligation, wow. So, pwede rin nato ni subton, a performance that depends upon a condition. Okay? An obligation nga naay condition. That's what we call conditional obligation. But the question is, ma'am, unsa man ning condition? In civil law, condition is considered as a future and uncertain event. Okay? Take note. Future and uncertain. Okay? So pasabot dili pa ta sure, kaya nga sabi ko kanina, unlike sa pure na 100% na gyud ka nga sure nga naay obligation, naa kay obligasyon, 100% sure nga naa kay dawatonon, kaning conditional obligation dili pa sure. Kaya nga siya sinasabing condition. Hindi ka pa sure kung mangyayari or hindi, kung mag-a-arise or hindi. Why? Because the event is uncertain. Okay? Malabo pa. And let's have this example. Mrs. Saw obliges herself to give her daughter Pia 10,000 if, this is one way para malaman mo na ang obligation is not pure kasi may makikita kang if. That indicates na may condition, right? If Pia will pass her final exam in Oblicon this coming June. Future, bakit sa tinawag na future? Kasi mangyayari pa lang kailan? June. And uncertain. Bakit uncertain? Hindi pa naman tayo sure kung papasa ba siya or hindi ngayong June. Right? So, hindi pa tayo sure kung makakatanggap nga ba si Pia ng 10,000. Hindi pa tayo sure kung magkaka-obligation nga ba si Mrs. So ng 10,000. Because the obligation is a conditional obligation. There is this future and uncertain event kung saan magbe-base kung magkakaroon ba ng obligation or wala. Okay? That's clear. Another thing, pag sinabi nating condition, we could also say that this is a past but unknown. Okay? Yung kanina, future and uncertain. Mangyayari pa lang pero hindi tayo sure kung mangyayari nga ba o hindi. Ito naman, nangyari na pero hindi natin alam kung nangyari nga ba talaga. Example, Mrs. Saw obliges herself to give her daughter Pia 1,000 if, ayan na naman yung if, Pia have passed her Oblicon subject last semester. So, hindi pa nila alam. Siguro hindi pa na-release yung grades, hindi pa sila nag-inquire or etc. Basta hindi pa nila alam. It's just that nangyari na. Okay? Last semester pa yon. Past, but both parties hindi nila alam. Okay? Let's make this clear. Dapat hindi nila alam. Okay? Past and hindi nila alam, both of them. So, pag nalaman nila, pag na-release na yung grade and pumasa nga talaga si Pia, then Mrs. So now has this obligation to give 10,000. Pero pag hindi siya pumasa, then walang obligation na mangyayari. That's what we call again, conditional obligation. Let's talk about Article 1181. In conditional obligations, the acquisition of rights as well as the extinguishment or loss of those already acquired na rights shall depend upon the happening of the event. Kaya nga siya tinawag na condition, okay? The happening of the event. Now, let's have these kinds of condition according to effect. First, suspensive condition. Pag sinabi nating suspensive condition or we sometimes call this condition precedent or condition antecedent, okay? This means that the fulfillment of the condition will give rise or give birth to an obligation. Ibig sabihin, ngayon pa lang, the moment na magsabot ang duha ka parties, wala pa nag-arise ang obligation, wala pa'y buhaton nga obligasyon. But when the event happens, that's the time na mag-arise na ang condition, ang obligation. Example, I will give you my watch if Mario will propose to me next week. Future, bakit future? Kasi next week pa. Uncertain, hindi naman tayo sure, hindi naman natin hawak ang choices ni Mario, hindi naman natin hawak ang pag-iisip ni Mario, kaya uncertain tayo kung magpo-propose nga siya next week, okay? And according to suspensive condition, if mangyari nga na si Mario ay mag-propose next week, ibibigay ko sa'yo yung watch ko. Okay? This means, pag sinabi natin suspensive condition, sinususpend niya muna ang pag-perform ng obligation. Okay? Hindi ko muna gagawin. Suspended muna yung obligation kong ibigay ang watch or ibigay yung relo ko. Kung nangyari yung condition, pag nag-propose si Mario sa'yo next week, then saka ko na ibibigay. That's suspensive condition. Again, the fulfillment will give rise or give birth to an obligation. Ano naman tong pangalawa? Resolutory condition, or we sometimes call this condition subsequent. Kanina, precedent or antecedent. Ngayon naman, subsequent. The condition or the fulfillment of the condition will extinguish. Ibig sabihin, the obligation will come to an end. Wala nang magiging obligation kung nangyari ang resolutory condition. Example, I will give you 1,000 monthly until you graduate in college. Resolutory condition, karon pa lang, nagsabot ta, obliged na ko dayon nga muhatag og 1,000. Pero, pag moabot ng condition, mahitabo ang condition, mawala na pod akong obligation. Ano yung condition dito? Ikaw ay makakagraduate na sa college. Yan yung kondisyon. Pag nangyari to, anong mangyayari sa obligation ko na 1,000 monthly? Mamamatay. Ayan, RIP. Okay? Magkaiba sila dun sa suspensive. 'Di ba? Sa suspensive, karon ta nagsabot, pero di pa nako ihatag ang watch. Kanusa nako ihatag ang watch? Pag nahitabo na ang proposal. Dito naman sa kabila, karon pa lang maghatag nako sa 1,000 monthly. Okay? Na dayon akong obligation. Pero pag mag-graduate na ka, wala na dayon ko'y obligasyon. Okay? So nakita nimo ang difference sa suspensive, ang obligation is suspended. Pag mahitabo ang condition, saka pa nako buhaton akong obligasyon. Sa resolutory, gagawin ko na ngayon ang obligation ko. I will give you 1,000 monthly starting from now. Pero pag mahitabo ang condition, that's the time that my obligation will end. Wala na akong gagawing obligation. Okay? So, suspensive, resolutory. Just take note, birth, yung sa kabila, birth of an obligation. Sa resolutory naman, extinguishment. Ayan, mawawala na. Mag-i-end na ang obligation. 1179 says, every obligation whose performance does not depend upon a future or uncertain event or upon a past event unknown to the parties is demandable at once. Ibig sabihin, demandable immediately. Ang tinutukoy niyo po dito is a pure obligation kasi it does not depend daw from any event. So, pure obligation. Every obligation naman which contains a resolutory condition, ganun din, demandable at once, di ba? Pareha ka ganina, I will give you 1,000 monthly. So, starting from now, bibigay ko na sa'yo yung 1,000 monthly. Pero pag nag-graduate ka na, ayan, wala na rin akong obligation. So, demandable at once. Therefore, an obligation which is demandable at once, so far yung pinag-usapan natin, first, if it is pure. If it is pure obligation, it is immediately demandable. Pwede ka nang mag-demand sa obligation, performance, at si debtor naman, agad-agad magkakaroon ng obligation. The same goes with resolutory. So, the moment na nag-promise siya, nga iyan ang buhaton, then pwede na pud ka nga mag-demand. Kaya nga lang, pag mahitabo ang isa ka event, pwede na pud tuputlon ang kadto nga obligation. Again, these obligations are demandable at once or immediately demandable. Magkaiba sila dun sa suspensive kasi sa suspensive, mamaya na siya magiging demandable kapag nangyari na ang isang event. Examples. Sige nga. Let's have this short activity. Anybody who could tell me what kind of obligation, what kind of obligation has been presented in the following example? So anybody could answer. First, SpongeBob obliges himself to give 10 pineapples to Patrick. What kind of obligation is this? Pure? Parang may question mark ka pa ata. Di ka pa sure, Noreen? Okay. Actually, this is a pure obligation. If you could notice, walang condition, wala ding sinabing date, okay? Wala ding deadline or walang date. So, this is immediately demandable. So, si Patrick, pwede niya nang i-demand kaagad si SpongeBob na, uy, SpongeBob, i-deliver mo na yung 10 pineapples. Or si SpongeBob, pwede niya nang i-deliver yung 10 pineapples agad-agad. Okay? Kasi wala namang condition. So, we have Noreen who answered pure. How about this? Mrs. Puff promised to give her car to SpongeBob if SpongeBob will be hired after his job interview tomorrow. What kind of obligation is this? Yes, conditional. Specifically, what kind of conditional obligation? We have two, suspensive or resolutory. So, specifically, ano to? Alright, suspensive. Bakit siya tinawag na suspensive? Kasi mamaya ko pa gagawin ang obligation. Mamaya pa gagawin ni Mrs. Puff ang obligation niyang i-deliver or ibigay ang car kay SpongeBob if na-hire si SpongeBob tomorrow. Pag hindi siya na-hire, edi walang obligation si Mrs. Puff. Okay? Ibig sabihin nun, suspended pa lang ang obligation niya. So that's right. We have Mr. Mutya and ayan, Miss Norin and Miss Giliera. How about this one? Patrick bound himself to give Squid 500 per month until Bob learns how to drive. Okay. Nagsabot ang duha. Ilang gilibak si Bob. Di daw kabalo mo drive. So, nagpinustaanay ni silang duha ba? Sige, what kind of condition is this? Yes, this is a resolutory condition. So, karon pa lang daan, pwede na maningil si Squid og 500 until makabalo si Bob unsaon pag-drive. Okay? So, now you know how to differentiate or how to determine rather, identify obligations with conditions. Kung suspensive ba siya, resolutory. Take note that this is very important para sa itong understanding sa future nga mga provisions. Okay? Dapat makasabot yun tag-unsa ning suspensive, resolutory. Okay, let's have this short activity. Anybody, just 3, okay? First 3 students who could give me other obligations that are subject to suspensive or resolutory conditions. Sige nga. At least 3. Who wants to go first? Actually, that was, okay, sa mga sumagot kanina, that would be 5 points for your participation. So, we have Noreen, Mr. Mutya, Giliera. Okay. Giliera and Sanchez. Okay. Sige, anybody? Wala. Sige na. Any example lang yung maisip, condition. You could turn on your mic if you want, pero dili na ta mag-type-type. Sige? Hello? Kami nga ba ani nga klase, uy? Dito sa Pikas, murag maglumbaan ay pasilag ko tingog. Ah, naman ni Dere. Miss, biatong ba sa isa-isahon ni Be? O sige, we have Miss Norin. Iya pa dyan type. I agreed to give ate 500 every month until Kuya finish his research study. Sige, what kind of obligation is this, Miss Norin? We have Mr. Mutya. You are bound to our scholarship until the day you finish the board exam. Ano po ibig sabihin nito? You are bound to our scholarship. Like, kailangan niyang magiging scholar siya, ganun, until matapos niya yung board exam. Anna will give her cat to Lino. Ayan. Diba? Simple lang. Ay, ang ano po natin, ang activity natin is an obligation subject to suspensive or resolutory condition. I think itong Anna will give her cat, this is a pure obligation. Sige. Isip tayo ng obligation na may condition. Sige. Noreen said this is a resolutory condition, ma'am. Yes, resolutory condition. Ayan. Demandable immediately, but when the condition happens, the obligation will extinguish or it will come to an end. Okay? Sige. Okay? We have Miss Kamasura again and Mr. Mutya. Sige, I think wala nang dadagdag. Namang uban. Sige, thank you for that examples, for additional examples. Let's proceed with Article 1180. Ayan pa pala, Miss Alfanta, my mom promised to give me 500 every week for my allowance until I finished my study. Okay. So, future uncertain. Okay. Until you finish. Hindi naman tayo sure kung matatapos mo nga ba talaga. I mean, I'm not being negative here, but I want to determine if this is really future and uncertain. Kasi iba yung future and certain. Okay? Mamaya, pag-uusapan natin ano yung future and certain. So, dapat, pag gumawa tayo ng condition, it should be future and uncertain or past but unknown. So, tulad dito, his research study, hindi naman tayo sure kung matatapos niya ba talaga yung research study niya. Hindi rin tayo sure kung papasa nga ba siya sa board exam. Okay? Ito naman, hindi tayo sure kung until you finish your studies. Hindi naman tayo sure kung gagraduate ka nga ba talaga. O, diba? So, that's a condition. Future and uncertain. So, let's proceed with Article 1180. That's Miss Alfanta nga pala. Okay. When the debtor binds himself to pay his means, permit him to do so, the obligation shall be deemed to be one with the period. Okay. This article, babalikan natin to siya mamaya. Kasi sabi niya dito, one with the period. Okay. Obligation with the period, that's section 2. Pinag-uusapan pa lamang natin dito is pure and conditional. Although dito siya nilagay just to remind us na pag sinabing his means permit him to do so, hindi siya condition. Okay? This is obligation with a period. Again, pag-uusapan natin ito mamaya. Sa section 2. Babalikan ka lang namin ha, 1180. Let's proceed to 1182. When the fulfillment of the condition, ayan, depends, nagadepende daw sa sole will of the debtor, okay? Kung kinsa pa tong naiutang, siya pa magbuot sa condition, the condition shall be void. Sa malamang, siya naiutang, siya pag yun magbuot, di ba? If it depends upon chance or upon will of a third person, it shall take effect in conformity with the provisions of this code. So that means this is valid. Yung pangalawang sentence, that will render our condition valid. Okay? Ano-ano po ba yung kinds of condition? First, according to whose will it depends. Okay? First, we have potestative. Kanina, we talked about kinds of condition as to effect. Okay? Di ba dalawa? Suspensive at saka resolutory. Ito naman, kinds of condition according to whose will it depends. So, kinsay magbuot. Pag sinabi nating potestative, it means one of the parties. Isa sa kanila ang magbuot. Okay? Sa Tagalog sa magbuot. Ang magbuot sa condition. It could be the creditor or the obligee. Siya ang magbuot unsa ang condition, or the debtor or the obligor. Again, when we talk about condition that depends upon the will of one of the parties, we call this potestative. So, lahi po dayto ma'am, katong silang duha ang magbuot, lahi po to. Okay? First, kaning ang usa lang ang magbuot. Example, creditor's will. Pag si creditor ang magbuot. Example, Plankton borrowed 10,000 from Mr. Krabs and is payable upon the demand of Mr. Krabs. Kinsa man ni si Plankton? Di ba mao man ni ang debtor? Borrowed 10,000. Mr. Krabs here is the creditor. Kinsay magbuot? Upon the demand of Mr. Krabs, the creditor. Okay? Ang sinabi dun sa Article 1182, tama ba? Or 81 ba yun? Pag si debtor ang magbuot, it is void. This particular problem, si creditor man ang nagbuot, that means this is valid. Another example, Squid obliged himself to give his flute to Patrick if Patrick joins the music club. Sino si Squid? Siya ang nai-obligation to deliver the flute. So, siya ang debtor. Patrick, siya ang mudawat. This is the creditor now. Okay? Unsa daw ang obligation? After the word if Patrick joins the club. So, kay kinsa man nakasalalay ang condition? Di ba kay Patrick? Okay? Sa kanya nakasalalay ang fulfillment of the condition. And Patrick here again is the creditor. That means the obligation again is valid. So, both conditions or both obligations are valid. The conditions are based solely upon the will of the creditor. So, si creditor naa kay creditor nakasalalay ang performance or fulfillment of the obligation. Then, these obligation and conditions are valid. Let's talk about potestative resolutory kasi kanina, suspensive yon. Resolutory naman. Star promised to shoulder the tuition fee of her sister until she finished college. Star dito is the debtor. Okay? And the creditor, ang iyahang sister. And kanino nakasalalay ang fulfillment ng kay until. Ito, isang term din to. Pag may nakita kayong until, then probably it's a resolutory condition. Okay? So, the fulfillment of the condition lies upon whom? She. Sino bang she dito? It's the sister. Okay? Sister here is the creditor. So, sa kanya nakasalalay ang fulfillment ng condition. That means this is again valid. Another, Gary lets Bob live under his house until Bob acquired his own house. Si Gary dito is the debtor. Ano yung obligation niya? Ang promise niya na patitirahin muna si Bob, who is the creditor here, until makahanap si Bob ng sariling bahay. So, Bob here again is the creditor. So, again, this is a valid obligation and condition. So, the conditions again are based solely upon the will of the creditor, hence valid. Let's talk about potestative suspensive debtor's will. Dito naman, si debtor ang magbuot. Okay? Sa iya nakasalalay ang fulfillment of the condition. Example, I will pay you 1,000 if I want. Ako dito is the debtor. Ako yung may utang. Ikaw naman dito ang creditor. And if I want. If I want. So, ibig sabihin, sa akin nakasalalay ang fulfillment ng condition. And ako yung debtor. So, ang mahitabuan, hindi na lang ko mubayad. Maingon na lang kung di na ko gusto mo bayad. Therefore, I won't pay you because I don't want to. Okay? So, ma'am, di man na pwede. Yes, kaya nga tinawag nilang void. Example, another. I will pay you upon the sale of the house in which I live. Ayan, ako pa rin yung debtor. I will pay you, ikaw yung creditor, upon the sale of the house in which I live. Nakadepende sa akin kung ibibenta ko yung bahay or hindi. Okay? So, di na lang na ako ibaligi ang balay kaya para di ko kabayad sa akong utang sa imuha. Then here, both the obligations and conditions, suspensive conditions specifically, are void. Okay? So, that means, hindi po mag-i-exist ang obligation na ito as well as the conditions. Another, let's talk about potestative suspensive debtor's will. Ingato lang gihapon. Pero let's have this another example. Plankton borrowed 10,000 from Mr. Krabs. Again, Plankton here is the debtor and Mr. Krabs is the creditor. Payable after 2 months. So that's the original obligation. Subsequently, later, Plankton promised to pay Mr. Krabs when Plankton goes to Manila. To which Mr. Krabs agree. Nag-agree naman si Mr. Krabs kagaling. Subsequently, Plankton promised. Plankton is the debtor. Promised to pay Mr. Krabs when Plankton goes to Manila. Ito yung condition. Mr. Krabs, babayaran kita pag pumunta na ako ng Manila, ha? Ayan. Sa kanya pa rin nakasalalay. Sabi naman ni Mr. Krabs, sige, okay lang. Ano ngayon ang iisipin ni Plankton? Hindi ako pupunta ng Manila para hindi ako makakapagbayad para hindi niya ako papagbayarin ng 10,000 dun sa inutang ko. This is again a suspensive condition which depends upon the sole will of the debtor, hence void. Okay? Note, however, that in this particular problem, ito lang po ang void. Itong subsequent happening. Itong condition. Dito na kasi nag-arise yung condition. Only the condition is void. Itong pre-existing obligation, itong 10,000 na first na nangyari, this continues to be valid. Okay? The obligation is valid. The condition is void. Kasi later na nila nahisgutan ang condition. Okay? Dito sa kabilang problem natin, simultaneous, kung kailan nangyari ang obligation sa kapod nila gihisgutan ang condition. Therefore, both the obligations and the conditions are void. Dito naman, pre-existing. Okay? May utang na. And then later na nila gisabutan ang condition. So, only the condition is void. The original obligation still exists. Valid pa rin yun. Okay? So, again, we are talking here about potestative suspensive debtor's will. Let's talk about potestative resolutory. Bob obliged himself to give Gary 1 sack of rice every month until Bob wants to do so. Bob here is the debtor. Ano yung obligation niya? To give Gary, who is the creditor, 1 sack of rice every month until gusto niya. Okay, so siya lang ang magbuot hangtod sa kung kanus-an niya gusto maghatag og bugas. That's resolutory. Next. Yan lang pala. Although the condition is dependent upon the sole will of the debtor, di ba? Pansin nyo, sa kanya nakasalalay, debtor, but this is resolutory. This condition is valid. Okay? This condition is valid. Balikan po natin ang article, provision, para ma-emphasize nato. Sana nga ba yun? Okay. Article 1182, when the fulfillment of the condition, ang condition di ay nga ginahisgutan diri friends is suspensive to be specific. Suspensive condition that will make it void. Therefore, to summarize, when we talk about again potestative, the condition is based solely upon the will of one of the parties. And to summarize, pag according to debtor's will tapos suspensive, yan lang yung time na magiging void ang condition and obligation or yung condition lang. Depende kung nag-exist na daan ang obligation. Everything else, valid po. Okay? Debtor's will, suspensive, void. Everything else, valid. So that's for potestative. We have another kind of condition according to whose will it depends. The second one is what we call casual. And when we talk about casual, this depends upon chance or upon the will of a third person. Nadaing ana, ma'am, nga nasa third person nakasalalay? Yes. Example. Larry, a building constructor, obliged himself to repair the house of Sandy if it will be damaged by an earthquake. This is upon chance, okay? Hindi mo naman hawak ang movement ng lupa. If damaged by an earthquake occurring within 10 years from the date of completion. So, hindi po nakasalalay kay Larry, hindi po nakasalalay kay Sandy ang condition. It's upon chance. Okay? And that chance is the earthquake in this particular problem. So, kapag nagka-earthquake, then magkakaroon ng obligation si Larry. Pag wala naman, within the 10-year period, then wala siyang magiging obligation kay Sandy. So, again, this is just a casual condition. Gary promised to sell his land to Krabs if he wins the case which is pending before the Supreme Court. This is another example. So, si Gary ngayon ang magiging debtor. Kanino niya ibibigay or ibibenta rather ang land? Kay Krabs. Pero ano yung condition niya? If he wins. And sino po ang, who will determine kung mananalo siya or hindi sa kaso niya? Di ba kung sino yung prosecutor or yung judge sa Supreme Court? So, upon the will of the third person. Hindi si Gary, hindi si Krabs, okay? Hindi sa kanila nakasalalay ang fulfillment, kundi to someone else. The judge in the Supreme Court. So, again, this is an example of a casual condition. Next, the third one is the mixed. From the term itself, mixed, pinaghalong chance and will of the third person. Example, Larry, a building constructor, obliged himself to repair the house of Sandy any damage to the building taking place after an earthquake. Okay, that's the chance. If found by a panel of arbitrators, ito naman yung mga third persons, that construction defects contributed in any way to the damage. Okay? So, kapag nagkaroon ng damage dahil may earthquake, and napatunayan na because of construction defects, no, tungod sa ihang negligence in the construction of the building, nagkaroon ng damage. So, sinong magdidetermine? The arbitrators. So, upon chance, upon the will of a third person. So this is again an example of a mixed condition. Again, we have potestative, one of the contracting parties. We have casual, upon chance or upon third person, and mixed. So pinaghalong chance tsaka third person. So 1183, let's proceed. Impossible obligations. Those contrary to good customs or public policy and those prohibited by law shall annul the obligations which depends upon them. Impossible. Okay? Shall annul. So, ibig sabihin, magkakaroon ng walang visa. If the obligation is divisible, okay, pwede na to siya i-determine, pwede na to siya hation or to siyang i-divide, then kadto lang part nga wala naapektuhan ang valid. Katong naapektuhan sa impossible condition, then mao to siya ang void. The condition not to do an impossible thing shall be rendered as not having agreed upon. Okay? So according to the previous provision, Article 1183, here are the types of impossible conditions. We have physically impossible conditions. These are naturally impossible to happen. For example, you cannot fly to the moon. Okay, that's physically impossible. You cannot swim across Pacific Ocean. That's physically impossible. Hindi mo kayang mag-drill ng lupa papunta sa core ng Earth, okay? So, those are physically impossible conditions. Another type is legally impossible conditions. Those conditions that are naturally possible, yes, pwede mong gawin, but those are contrary to law. Example, ang pumatay, okay? Posible naman, pwede mo namang gawin yon, kaya nga lang, it's contrary to law, so it's legally impossible condition. Or, contrary to morals. For example, you slap your father, sampalin mo yung ama mo, okay? Or good customs, public order, or public policy. Okay? So, yung mga contrary to these, pwede mong gawin, posible mong gawin, pero hindi mo pwedeng gawin because they are not legal, they are not morally good, they are not according to customs, public order, or public policy. Okay? So, ano po ang magiging effect pag ang condition po ay impossible? Pag sinabing impossible, it's either physically impossible or legally impossible, ha? So, ano po yung magiging effect? Basically, the obligation and the condition are void. Example, if I will give you 100,000 if you kill X. Okay? The condition here is killing X. This is naturally possible. Pwede ko namang patayin si X. Kaya nga lang, this is legally impossible. Therefore, the obligation, ano nga yung obligation? Ang pagbigay ko sa'yo ng 100,000 and the condition, ang pagpatay kay X, both are void. So, it's as if walang obligation na nag-exist. Okay? Another example. I will pay you 10,000 if you can swim across the Pacific Ocean. You cannot swim across the Pacific Ocean. This is physically impossible. Therefore, the obligation of paying you 10,000 as well as the condition of swimming across Pacific Ocean, both are void. Next, effect of impossible conditions if it is a negative obligation. Negative or not to do. Example, I will give you 100,000 if you do not swim across Pacific Ocean. Okay, pwede na nila mo paninglo ng 100,000. You simply don't swim across Pacific Ocean. Hello, sino pa naman makakagawa niyan? Then go. Bigay mo na yung 100,000. Or, I will pay you 10,000 if the sun will not set today. Of course, the sun will always set. It always rises, it always sets, then go. Bigay mo na sa akin yung 10,000 na yan. Okay? The obligations here are considered pure. Anong ibig sabihin ng pure? Demandable immediately. Walang kondisyon. Ito, may condition man. May condition nga, but not to do naman. Not to do, tapos impossible condition. Okay? Let's be specific. Not to do, but impossible obligation. Impossible condition. So, it's as if walang kondisyon. And wala din tayong specific date or period, then this is immediately demandable or a pure obligation. So, yan yung magiging effect pag ang condition mo ay impossible. Another, If it is a pre-existing obligation, ibig sabihin, andyan na yung obligation, then only the condition is void. Mura siya kadtong utang ka ganina nga 10,000 kang Mr. Krabs. Tapos subsequently, na ay condition nga void. Only the condition is void. Example, Larry borrowed 10,000 from Sandy. Subsequently, ayan, ito, existing na ang obligation. Wala naman tayong problema sa obligation. Saan tayo nagka-problema? Sa condition. Anong sabi? Larry promised to pay Sandy after Sandy steals. Kailangan mo pang magnakaw bago ka bayaran. The laptop of Bob to which Larry agreed. Kailangan mo pang magnakaw. Ayan. So, only the condition is void, but the 10,000 loan will continue to exist as a valid condition. So, these are the effects if, again, the condition is impossible. Let's talk about 1184, the condition that some event happen at a determinate time shall extinguish the obligation as soon as the time expires or if it has become indubitable that the event will not take place. Okay? Extinguish, ibig sabihin, it will come to an end. When? Kanus daw? We're talking here about suspensive, ha? Suspensive. As soon as the time expires, okay, nag-expire, tapos hindi pa rin nangyayari ang condition, or the event will not take place. Okay? Imposible na mangyayari ang condition, although hindi pa tayo dumating dun sa deadline. Example, Ellen obliges herself to give JL 10,000. So, this is the condition now, to give 10,000. If JL will marry Bea before JL reaches the age of 30. Mamura man siyang obligation with a period, kay na ako'y deadline. Yes, para siyang obligation with a period, but still this is uncertain event. How sure are you na papakasalan siya ni Bea? Okay? So, still this is a condition or conditional obligation and not an obligation with a period. So, Ellen is liable if JL marries Bea before he reaches 30 years old. Unsa ganitong condition, hatagan daw niyang 10,000 kung pakaslan ni JL si Bea before pa siya mag-30. So karon napakaslan man niya. Let's say 29 years old siya, napakaslan niya si Bea. Then Ellen now is liable. So balikan natin yung sabi ng provision, the obligation is extinguished as long as the time expires. As soon nag-expire without taking place, or it is the event will not take place. Okay? So let's have this. Ellen is not liable. Ito na yung sinasabi niyang extinguish. Hindi na siya magkakaroon ng liability. Wala ng obligation. Kailan? Kapag pinakasalan ni JL si Bea, nung 30 years old na siya, or after. Kasi unsa daw ang ilahang sabot, kailangan niya pakaslan before 30 years old. So, although iyang gipakaslan, but nag-expire naman. Okay? Nag-expire na ang ilahang sabot na 30 years old. So, hindi na siya magiging liable. Or, Ellen is not liable if JL died. Bisan pa, wala pa siya naabot og 30, ayaw na paabotag maabot siya 30. Okay? Makulbaan siya hala, basig maabot na siya 30. Patay na nga siya. That means, hindi na pwedeng mangyari pa ang condition. So, balikan natin. As soon as the time expires, okay? Pag niabot na siya 30, and the event, wala na hitabo, then wala ka ng obligation. Or, it is not possible na the event will take place. Okay? The event will not take place, you're sure already na hindi na siya mangyayari kahit pa hindi pa dumating yung deadline. Kahit pa hindi pa siya dumating ng 30. Pero sure ka nang hindi mangyayari dahil JL is already dead. Okay? So, that's the time that the obligation will now be extinguished. 1185. 1185 here talks about negative suspensive condition. Okay? The obligation is demandable. Kaganina, positive, suspensive. Karon, negative, suspensive. The obligation is demandable. Kaganina, extinguish. Karon, demandable. Kanus daw? As soon as the time has elapsed without the event taking place, or as soon as it has become evident that the event will not take place. Balikan natin. Carla obliges herself to give DJ 10,000 if DJ is not yet married. Okay? Suspensive gihapon siya, kaya nga lang, it is not to do. Kaya siya negative, suspensive. Not. Wag mong gagawin to. Kapag hindi mo to ginawa, until ganitong oras, until ganitong araw, bibigyan kitang pera. Hindi siya katulad kay Ellen ganina. Gawin mo to at babayaran kita ng 10,000. Dito naman, wag mo tong gawin at bibigyan kitang 10,000. Okay? Wag niya daw pakasalan si Kath until the end of 2022. Kapag nagawa niya yon, bibigyan niya ng 10,000 si DJ. Now, Carla is not liable if wag gyud kahulat si DJ, gipakaslan gyud niya si Kath on 2022 or before that, let's say 2021, okay? Or January 2022, pinakasalan niya, then hindi magiging liable si Carla kasi ang ilahang sabot bayaran ti ka or hatagan ti kag 10,000 kung dili nimo siya pakaslan at the end of 2022. Pinakasalan mo eh. So hindi ako magiging liable. Or what if pinakasalan ni DJ after 2022 na? So, let's say, January 1, 2023. Grabe, saragid ka adlaw, no? So, gipakaslan niya after 2023. Will Carla be liable? Yes. Kaya ang sabot nila, dili pakaslan before or dili niya pakaslan until mahuman ang 2022. And nagawa niya naman, ibig sabihin, magiging liable ngayon si Carla. Or what if ganito? Kath died before the end of 2022. So, hindi na niya talaga mapapakasalan si DJ. Never ever. Therefore, Carla will still be liable. Kaya ilahang sabot, not man. Isa malamang di niya mapakaslan. Patay na nga, di ba? So, the 10,000 will now be demandable. Magiging liable na ngayon si Carla. Okay? So, that's 1185. So, we talked about positive, suspensive, and negative suspensive. So, kung actually, di lang kita ma-overwhelm sa kung giingon, unsay giingon sa provision, ato lang yung sabtono ang sitwasyon. Okay? Common sense lang yun ni. Let's have 1186. The condition shall be deemed fulfilled when the obliger voluntarily prevents its fulfillment. Ito naman may mga scam na naman nagalawan. Example, Ninoy promised to sell his land to Rodi if Rodi would be able to secure a loan from the BDO. Sige, bibigay ko sa'yo, bibenta ko sa'yo tong lupang to kapag nakakuha ka ng loan sa BDO. So, naningkamot karon si Rodi nga makakuha loan. Later, Ninoy changed his mind. Murag nindot niya akong yuta. Di na lang kaya na ako ni baligya. So, what he did, he induced the bank. Ayan. So, gisabotahin niya ang BDO para dili hatagang loan si Rodi aron dili madayon og palit ni Rodi ang yuta kasi ayaw niya nang ibenta. So, in this particular example, the obliger voluntarily prevents. Ayan. Ayaw niya nang mangyari ang kondisyon. Therefore, the condition is deemed complied with. Okay? It's as if nangyari ang kondisyon and Ninoy now is liable to sell his land. Oh, ayaw mo palang mangyari ang kondisyon ha? Nasakpan bitaw ka da. You are now liable to sell your land. Kasi, you prevented the fulfillment of the condition. Sabot-sabot pa ka niya, di man di ka gusto nga madayon ang sabot. Diba? Another example. Joshua obliges himself to allow Gerald to occupy the former's house. So, former, ibig sabihin si Joshua, okay? So, sabi ni Joshua, sige Gerald, ikaw na muna ang magstay dito sa bahay ko sa Davao. Kasi, andun ako sa Manila. So, as long as andun ako sa Manila, ikaw muna ang titira sa bahay ko. So, tuwang-tuwa naman si Gerald. When Gerald learned that Joshua will be transferred to Davao, ayan, narinig niya na, uy, parang ma-assign ulit si Joshua sa Davao. So, ibig sabihin, papaalisin na siya doon sa bahay kasi babalik na si Joshua. Para hindi siya mapaalis, he induced the president of the company para mag-assign ng ibang tao dito sa Davao para hindi pa rin makabalik si Joshua, para siya pa rin ang magstay sa bahay. Here, the obligation is extinguished because Gerald voluntarily prevented the condition. Hence, kailangan niya nang umalis sa bahay. Okay? Ikaw ha, scammer ka. So, umalis ka ngayon sa bahay ko, layas. Alright? Kasi, the obligor voluntarily prevents the fulfillment of the condition. Let's talk about 1187. The effects of a conditional obligation to give once the condition has been fulfilled shall retroact. Pag sinabi nating retroact, babalik to the day of the constitution of the obligation. Para mas maintindihan, let's have this example. Retroactive effects. Di ba pag may tag retro music, kasi pasabotan ng retro music, makadungog mo na sa radyo. Retro music ka ng mga old na music, di ba? Mga music sa previous generation, 'di ba? Mga isang linggong pag-ibig. So kana mga retro, ibig sabihin before, sa una. On January 20, Simon agreed to sell his parcel of land to Peter for 100,000. So January 20 sila nagsabot. Pero na kondisyon, unsang kondisyon? Should Peter lose a case involving the recovery of another parcel of land. So, kapag natalo ka dyan sa kaso mong yan, sige, ibibenta ko na lang tong lupang to kasi kawawa ka naman. Okay, now on April 10, so hulat-hulat na si Simon, wala na siya kahulat. On April 10, Simon sold his land to John. Okay? Kasi dugay man kaayo mahuman ang kaso, parang feeling na siguro niya, madaog si Peter, kaya di ba, ang condition is mapildi. Feeling niya siguro mananalo si Peter, kaya binenta niya na lang sa iba. However, they realized that on December 5, Peter lost the case. So, pupunta na ngayon si Peter kay Simon. Peter, natalo ako dun sa kaso ko, wala na ngayon akong lupa. Di ba sabi mo, di ba nag-agree tayo, ibibenta mo yung lupa mo sa akin. Paano niya pa ibibenta? Yan doon na kay John, kasi binenta na nung April 10. Ano yung magiging effect nito? According to 1187, the right of Peter shall retroact. Babalik dun sa araw kung kailan sila nag-constitute ng agreement. As if Peter was entitled to the land beginning January 20. Hence, Peter has a better right than John. Kahit pa nabili mo na yan, tol, ako pa rin yung may better right. Bakit? Yung right kong ito, magre-retro kung kailan kami nag-agree. That was on January 20. So, even though December 5 pa nahitabo ang condition, okay, it will retroact to the day of constitution of the obligation. Okay? But take note, balikan natin. This only applies to an obligation to give. Okay? It applies to an obligation to give only. Nevertheless, dito sa second paragraph, when the obligation imposes reciprocal prestations, the fruits and interest, it will be mutually compensated. Okay. So, ayun. So, ngayon, pupunta na ngayon si Peter doon kay Simon. Simon, bibilhin ko na yung lupa. Sasabihin ngayon ni Simon, ay, sorry, nabenta ko na kay John. Ikaw, Peter, pwede mong puntahan si John. Sasabihin mo kay John, kukunin mo yung lupa kasi ikaw ang bibili. In the first place, sa imo man siya una nakigsabot. Okay? So, magkaiba to dun sa illustration natin before, no? Nga kung kinsay unang gihatagan sa titulo sa yuta. Kanimanggo, this is subject to a condition. So, kailangan dapat hulaton ni Simon kung nahitabo ba yun or wala ang kondisyon bago niya ibenta or bago niya i-promise or ibigay dun sa iba. Okay? Kasi may condition kang hinihintay. So, Peter now could restore the possession of the land. So, pwede niyang bilhin. So, si John ngayon, wala na siyang land. Or, pwede niya na lang i-let go. Okay? Kung mapagkumbaba naman si Peter, pwede niya nang i-let go. Pero dapat, okay, take note ha, meron tong mga formalities. Katulad na lamang ng dun sa document, I think it's a deed, something, okay, deed. Basta may document dapat na sa likod ng document na yon, a certificate of title, Okay, parang certificate of title yon. Sa certificate of title ng lupa, kailangan naka-annotate doon, nakalagay doon that this has been promised to Peter. Should Peter lose the case. So, kailangan andun siya. Hindi mo pwedeng verbal lang. Okay? Verbal lang na, uy, dyan, sa ako una gi-promise. So, kailangan andun talaga. Detailed. Okay? May mga formalities to. But, generally, it will retroact to the day kung kailan kayo nag-agree. Okay? So, mo lang na siya. Article 1188. The creditor may, before the fulfillment of the condition, bring the appropriate actions for the preservation of his right. The debtor may recover what during at the same time he has paid by mistake in case of a suspensive condition. Right of the creditor. Now, let's have this example. On January 20, Simon agreed to sell his parcel of land to Peter for 100,000 should Peter lose a case involving the recovery of another parcel of land. Ganun pa rin. Peter had his right annotated at the back of the certificate of title. So, ito yung sinasabi ko kanina. Dapat merong mga formalities para Peter will have the right or could have the right to retroact the condition as if he was entitled to the land beginning January 20. Okay? Balik lagi, no? And how about the right of the debtor? Another example, on January 1, Luke obliged himself to give 5,000 to Mark when Mary arrives from Canada. So, ang condition, kanino nagbe-base? Sa third person. So, this is an example of casual, no? Casual condition. It depends upon a third person. Sino yung third person? Si Mary. Ayan. So, napustaan ay siguro ni si Luke o si Mark. So, having heard that Mary was already in the Philippines, so akala niya siguro andun na si Mary, pumunta ngayon si Luke kay Mark. O Mark, bibigay ko na yung 5,000 kasi andito na si Mary. Okay, on March 1. However, a month after, so on March 30, Luke learned that hindi pala yun si Mary ang dumating. Si Martha pala. Pero nabigay niya na yung 5,000. So this has, the obligation or the amount has been given to to Mark in mistake. Okay? Isang malaking pagkakamali ang pagbigay ko sa iyo ng 5,000 kasi hindi pala yun si Mary, si Martha pala yun. So, Luke now may recover what he has paid in mistake. Okay? Take note ha, dapat in mistake. Kasi pag binigay niya yung 5,000, kahit alam niyang wala pa si Mary, parang sinasabi niya na, sige, wag na nating hintayin yung condition, bibigyan na kita ng 5,000. Okay? So, kailangan may mistake doon. So, pwede niyang ma-recover on what ground? On the ground or on the principle of solutio indebiti. Ano sabi ni solutio indebiti? No one shall be unjustly enriched by the person is obliged to return what has been paid by mistake. Okay? Yun yung solutio indebiti, right? So, ngayon, if you could notice, 1 month na ang nilabay. So, aside from the 5,000, pwedeng manghingi ngayon si Luke ng interest of the 5,000. Okay? 5,000 plus interest. Bakit? Nagamit pa unta to niyang 5,000. Pwede pa unta to niyang invest sa stock exchange. Pero hindi niya nagamit kasi nabayad niya in mistake. O ngayon, si Luke naman, si Mark, enjoy naman siya dun sa 5,000. So, Luke may recover also the interest. Alright? The interest. Now, right of the debtor. Suppose that on March 15, okay, March 1, di ba ito siya nagbayad? March 15, Mary actually arrived in the Philippines. So, dumating nga siya. Kaso nga lang, hindi March 1. March 1 nagbayad si Luke. Dumating siyang March 15. Pero nalaman ni Luke na mali pala yung pagkakabayad niya noong March 1. Kailan niya nalaman? March 30 na. Doon niya na nalaman na, ay, hindi pala March 1. Dumating si Mary, March 15 na pala. Ngayon, pupunta ngayon si Luke noong March 30 doon kay Mark. Mark, mali pala yung pagkakabayad ko. Luke can no longer recover what he has prematurely paid. Bakit? Nangyari na rin naman. Dumating na rin naman si Mary, di ba? March 15. So, hindi siya pwedeng pumunta doon kay Mark ng March 30 na, Mark, hindi pala dumating si Mary nung March 1. Ibinigay ko na yung 5,000. Pwede ko bang kunin? So, sasabihin ngayon ni Mark, hindi mo na pwedeng kunin. Anyway, dumating na rin naman talaga si Mary. Kaya nga lang nung March 15. So, pwede niyang i-recover ang ang interest. Okay? Interest for 15 days. Bakit 15? March 1 kung kailan siya nagbayad at saka March 15 kung kailan na-fulfill ang condition. Kung kailan dumating si Mary. So, only the interest can be recovered. But, yung binayad niya doon sa obligation, hindi niya na pwedeng i-recover. Okay? So, that's for Article 1188. Let's proceed to 1189. When the conditions have been imposed with the intention of suspending the efficacy. Okay, we are going to talk here about improvements, loss, or deterioration of the thing. Ano yung magiging rule? Kasi 'di ba we're talking here again conditional obligation pa rin. Pero may rule tayo. Hindi ko muna ibibigay. Sige ha, we're talking here about suspensive. Okay? Intention of suspending. Suspensive condition. Hindi ko muna ibibigay hanggat sa hindi nangyayari yung condition. So, maghulat maghulat. While nagahulat mo nga mahitabo ang condition, na pwedeng mahitabo nga mawala ang thing, mag-deteriorate ang thing, or mag-improve ang thing kung suswertehin ka. Now, ano yung rules? Ano yung ang sinabi ni civil law or ni civil code about this? So, take note that Article 1189 applies only if ito yung mga requisites. It is a real obligation. Ano yung real obligation? To give. So, it only applies to an obligation to give. Second, kailangan yung object specific or determinate, hindi mo pwedeng bigyan ng substitute. And this is a suspensive obligation. Okay? Kailangan ma-fulfill yung condition. Kasi kung hindi naman na-fulfill yung condition, hindi mo rin naman ibibigay yung thing. Tama? Hindi rin mag-a-arise yung obligation mo. So, bakit pa natin ibibig deal ang loss, deterioration, at saka yung improvement kung hindi naman pala nag-arise ang obligation kasi hindi nangyari yung condition, right? So, kailangan mangyari yung condition. And, lastly, dapat may loss, deterioration, or improvement. Kung wala yung tatlong to, edi wala tayong pag-uusapan na 1189. Okay? Bakit? Ano po bang andun sa 1189? Rule when the loss of the thing or the thing was lost without the debtor's fault. Example, Henry obliged himself to give Shogu the car worth 100,000 if Shogu will sell Henry's property. So ngayon maghihintay pa kayo. Kasi hintayin niyo pang mabenta ni Shogu yung property ni Henry. However, yung car naman na the car, which is the object, the prestation of the obligation, was destroyed by accidental fire. Example, okay, let's assume further na nabenta na ni Shogu. So, nangyari na yung condition. Okay? Unsa ganitong requirements? First, a real obligation to give. In the example, to give what? To give the car. The car is specific and determinate. It is suspensive. Mamaya ko na ibibigay sa'yo kung nabenta mo na yung property ko. And nabenta niya nga. However, there was loss. Okay, nawala. Bakit? Accidental fire. Without debtor's fault. Because of that, the obligation is extinguished. Ito yung first rule. If the thing was lost without the debtor's fault, the obligation is extinguished. Hence, Henry now will not be liable even if nangyari na ang condition. Even if nabenta niya. So, nabenta niya ngayon ang property, let's say yung lupa. Babalik na yung si Shogu dun kay Henry. Henry, nabenta ko na yung lupa mo, akin na yung car. Sasabihin ngayon ni Henry, sorry kasi nasunog, accidental fire. May lightning kasi. So ngayon, walang magiging remedy si Shogu kasi fortuitous event yon. Di ba general rule ng fortuitous event? No person shall be held liable in fortuitous event. So wala ngayong habol si Shogu. Kasi hindi naman kasalanan ni Henry yung pagkawala ng car. Okay? So wala na ngayon ang obligation to give the car and wala na ring liability. Any liability like damages, wala ring babayaran si Henry. Take note ha, wala siyang kasalanan. Sa pangalawa, assuming that the car was destroyed or the fire was caused by Henry's negligence. So, meron na ngayong kasalanan si Henry. For example, naiwan niya sigurong naka-on or nakabukas ang LPG. O, ayan. So, the fire was caused by Henry's negligence, kapabayaan ni Henry. So, di ba, general rule, no person shall be held liable for fortuitous event, pero kailangan walang concurrent negligence of the debtor. Eh, dito may negligence, kaya exempted siya sa rule. Therefore, Shogo will be entitled to demand damages. Hindi niya na mahahabol yung car kasi sira na nga, nawala na, nasunog na. Pero, pwede siyang mag-demand for damages. Okay? So, yan yung magiging remedy niya. Bakit? Dahil nagkaroon ng fault on the part of the debtor. The third rule, there is deterioration. So, yung number 1 tsaka number 2, loss, like totally nawala. Okay? Dito naman, deterioration lang. Siguro nag-decrease lang ang value. Example, suppose that because of an accident to which Henry had no fault, okay, the car's windshield was broken and some of its paints were scratched. Ngayon, instead na 100,000, di ba unta to ang value sa car? Karon ang market value na lang sa car is 90,000 because of the deterioration. Now, what does 1189 says? It says, Shogu will suffer the deterioration. So, kukunin niya ngayon yung car, pero, yun na yun. Hindi na siya babayaran ng 10,000 na deficient or difference. Hindi na siya babayaran ni Henry. Kasi wala naman akong kasalanan doon. Okay? Hindi ko naman kasalanan kung bakit nasira. Kaya bumaba yung market value. So, ikaw na lang. Kaya ikaw na lang mag-suffer ng 10,000. However, in number 4, here, again, deterioration. Kaya nga lang, there is now debtor's fault. Suppose that the accident happened because of Henry's negligence or fault. So, kunwari, nilagay niya yung car doon sa gitna ng kalsada, kaya ngayon nasagasaan, di ba? So, kaya nasira yung windshield and all kasi maling pagkakapark. Ayun, there's negligence there. Ano ngayon ang remedy ni Shogu? Shogu may choose between rescission or cancellation plus damages. Ibig sabihin, sige, hindi ko na itutuloy yung car, pero bayaran mo ako ng damages, tsaka yung rescission. Okay? Bayaran mo ako ng 100,000 plus yung car. Or, I could demand the fulfillment. Sige nga, akin na lang yung car, pero magbabayad ka ng damages kasi naging pabaya ka. Okay? Choose between, ha? Hindi pwedeng dalawa. Hindi pwedeng manghingi siya ng 100,000 tapos hihingi niya din yung car, tapos hihingi pa siya ng damages. Hindi. It's either rescission, okay, or fulfillment plus damages in both remedies. Okay? Bakit siya nagkaroon ng ganitong remedies? Kasi may kapabayaan na nangyari on the part of the debtor. Now, number 5, improvement. In a very rare case, magkakaroon ng improvement yung thing by nature or by time. For example, suppose the market value of the car increased. Siguro, nagkakaubusan na ng car. Or siguro yung car na yon may parang amazing na feature na late na na-realize ng mga tao. So, naghahabol ngayon sila na bumili ng ganong klaseng model. Kaya, tumaas yung market value ng car. The improvement shall inure to the benefit of Shogu. So, hindi na makikinabang ngayon dun si Henry. So, for example, ang car, di ba, 100,000. Because the market value increased, so example, naging 120, ibibigay na ngayon yung car doon kay Shogu. Pero hindi ka na manghihingi ng 20. Okay, siya na ang makinabang dito sa increase of the market value. The same goes with the deterioration. Diba? Katong nag-decrease ang market value na himong 90,000, wala man ka naningil og 10,000. So, karon kung ning-improve, dito na po na, si Shogu na po ang mag-benefit. Kaya kung mag-deteriorate, siya man ang mo-suffer. Diba? Remember number 3? Tama ba? In number 3, ayan, si Shogu ang magsasuffer dun sa deterioration, yung normal na deterioration without debtor's fault. So, kung magkakaroon naman ng improvement, dapat lang, or it will be fair na siya lang po ang makinabang. Okay? Huwag ka nang manghingi pa ng 20,000. since it is Shogo who will suffer, it would be fair that si Shogo din yung mag-e-enjoy ng improvement. Okay? Now, paano naman kung nagkaroon ng improvement dahil ginastusan ni debtor? Okay? For example, during the pendency of the condition, Henry had a car painted and its seat cover changed. Ayan. Gumastos ka pa talaga para mag-improve ang thing. So, ngayon, anong mangyayari? According to the code, Henry will have the right granted to usufructuary. He may, however, remove such improvements should it be possible to do so without damage to the property. Ibig sabihin, hindi mo na din pagbabayarin si Shogo. So, sasabihin mo ngayon, uy, Shogo, nag-improve yung car. Kasi, binilhan ko ng ganito, ganyan, pinapinturahan ko. 20,000 din yung pagpapapintura ko niyan. So, bayaran mo ngayon ako ng 20,000. Hindi daw pwede yon. Bakit? Habang, nung mga panahon na pina-improve mo yung car, nakinabang ka rin naman. No? Kunwari, may bagong paint, okay? The car was newly painted. So, nagkaroon ka ngayon ng time na gamitin or makinabang dun sa newly painted car during the pendency of the condition. So, sa panahon na hindi pa nangyayari yung condition, ikaw ngayon ang gumagamit ng car. Ikaw ngayon ang nakinabang. Yun yung tinatawag na usufructuary. Okay? Ikaw ngayon ang nakinabang dun sa improvements na ginawa mo dun sa car. Okay? So, hindi mo na ngayon kailangang mag-demand ng payment from Shogo. So, pero kung gusto mo naman, para maging fair, kunin mo yung improvements na ginawa mo dun sa car. Okay? Provided na pag ginawa mo yun, pag ni-remove mo yung mga improvements na yun, dapat hindi ma-damage yung property. Okay? Kasi kapag na-damage yun, ayan, magbabayad ka ngayon ng damages dahil naging pabaya ka. So, para safe, huwag ka na lang magpa-improve ng thing. Kasi later, ibibigay mo rin naman dun sa creditor. If nangyari yung condition. So, huwag kang masyadong kampante na, baka hindi niya na masisell yung property, sa akin na lang tong car. Pagandahin ko na lang. And later, na-sell niya pala, nabenta niya pala. O siya ngayon ang makikinabang dun sa improvements na ginawa mo, di ba? So, to be safe, huwag kang masyadong galante. Okay? So, that is Article 1189. Now, let's talk about the effects of fulfillment of resolutory condition. So, kanina, suspensive yun. Ibibigay ko sa'yo kung nagawa mo yung condition. Ito naman, let's talk about this another thing. Effect if nangyari ang resolutory condition. Example, Joshua obliges himself to allow Gerald to occupy the former's house in Davao as long as Joshua is assigned by their company in Manila. Okay? So, it's the same as kanina, pero hindi na natin pinakomplicate. Okay? Resolutory. Diyan ka muna magstay, pero pag nakabalik ako, kailangan mo nang umalis. Okay? So, when the resolutory condition has been fulfilled, ibig sabihin, bumalik na si Joshua, the parties now shall return to each other what they have received. Ibig sabihin, ibabalik na ngayon ni Gerald ang bahay doon kay Joshua. Ito namang isang example na ito, magkaiba din. Papi binds himself to give Bebe 5,000 a month until Bebe passes the bar exam. Looking at this illustration, kapag pumasa ba si Bebe ng bar exam, kailangan niya bang bayaran si Papi ng 5,000? Or dun sa accumulated amount na binigay sa kanya ni Papi? Di ba parang hindi naman? If Bebe passes the bar exam, she need not return the amounts she has received because it is clear that the parties do not intend the return of the same. It's different from the Joshua Gerald illustration. Dito kasi, clear na kapag bumalik na si Joshua, ibabalik ni Gerald yung bahay. Okay? Pag na-fulfill na yung condition, ano yung condition? Pag bumalik na siyang Davao, di ba? Pag nangyari ngayon yung condition, kailangang ibalik ang thing. And the thing here is the house. Dito naman sa ikalawa, pag nangyari yung condition, which is the passing of the bar exam, hindi mo kailangang ibalik kasi hindi naman ganon ang intention ng contract or intention ng obligation. So, murago na siya sa scholarship, di ba? Himuon ka og scholar ni Ched. Okay? Pagka-graduate, himon kag scholar ni Ched, hataga, siya magbayad sa tuition hangtod sa makagraduate ka within 4 years. Pagka human nimo og graduate, does it mean bayaran nimo si Ched dito siyang gipa-eskwela sa imo? Di ba dili man? Okay? Di ba dili man? Dili pareha sa Gerald Joshua nga illustration. Okay? Unless explicitly stated nga kailangan nimong ibalik. Okay? Na yung mga ingana, di ba? Kay scholar ti ka, pero pag at the end, pag nakagraduate na ka, bayaran to nimo ang ako ang pangbayad sa imong tuition. Okay? It should be clear in the agreement na may ganon, na return of what has been received. Alright? So, let's proceed to Article 1191. Our time is 5:26. Okay. 91. Until 1192 lang naman ang pure and conditional obligations. Okay? Tapusin na natin. 1191. So, we are talking here about rescission of reciprocal obligations. Siguro para mas dali, let's have this illustration. In a contract of sale of car between Snail and Turtle, it was agreed that Snail, the owner, would deliver the car and the necessary documents at the house of Turtle on April 1. And Turtle would deliver the payment at the same place and date. So, this is now a reciprocal obligation. Pag sinabi kasi natin unilateral, balikan natin si unilateral. Unilateral, isa lang ang nai-obligation. For example, I promise to give you 1,000 as donation. Okay? Pag sinabing ganon, ako lang ang may obligation. Ikaw, wala ka nang gagawin. Gusto lang kitang bigyan ng 1,000, yun lang yun. Okay? And nag-promise ako, so ako yun lang yung may obligation. Ikaw, iguro ka mo dawat. Pag mingon taog bilateral, duha ang naay obligasyon. Okay? Ang isa na obligasyon dito sa isa, at the same time, katong nidawat na pud siya obligation, so murag magtuyok-tuyok lang ang obligation. Kaya nga lang, sa bilateral, we have two kinds. We have reciprocal and non-reciprocal. Okay, balikan na to. Unilateral o bilateral. Under the bilateral, we have two classes. We have reciprocal and non-reciprocal. Pag sinabing reciprocal, ibig sabihin na alay isa ka utang, isa ka cost, isa ka transaction, and then duha na dayon mo ang naay obligasyon or rights between each other. For example, contract of sale. Mamaligya ko sa imuha og libro, ang kantidad 500. Na ako'y obligation nga i-deliver ang libro, na apo kay obligation mo bayad og 500. Isa lang ka transaction. Unsay tawag sa transaction? Contract of sale. Alright? Pag mingon, mo na siyang ginatawag na bilateral, pero specifically, reciprocal. Again, if it's reciprocal, same cost. Debtor and creditor of each other for the same cause, the same transaction, the same event. Alright? Pag sinabi naman nating bilateral pero non-reciprocal, you are debtor and creditor of each other pero magkaibang transaction. Okay? For example, I promise to give you 1,000 tomorrow. Okay? So ngayon, meron akong obligasyon na 1,000. Ikaw, igurigig ka mo dawat. But you have this another obligation. You have the obligation to return what you have borrowed from me. Okay? Ibalik to nimong, let's say, ang akong rice cooker. Okay? Akong obligation, akong gipromise nga hatagan ti kag 1,000. Kay naluoy ko sa imo. Unyang imo ang obligation, ibalik sa kuha ang rice cooker kay imo raman tong gihiram sa kuha. Okay? So, we are debtor and creditor of each other. Ako nay utang sa imo, nay obligasyon sa imo, ikaw na po kay obligasyon sa kuha, pero dili related ang atoang obligations. Akoan 1,000 kay naluoy ko sa imo, tabang nako. Katong rice cooker pod, lahi pod to siya nga transaction. Imo lang tong iuli kay imo ra man tong gihiram. 1,000 has nothing to do with it. But still, we are debtor and creditor of each other, but with the thing there is from different transactions, from different costs, from different agreements, etc. Bilateral gihapon, but non-reciprocal. Okay? Here in 1191, we are talking here about
reciprocal obligations. Alright? In a contract of sale, ayan, snail and turtle, nabasa naman din nato nino. Turtle would deliver the payment at the same place. This is what? Reciprocal, tama? If snail does not comply, ano yung magiging remedy ni turtle? Hindi ngayon pumunta si snail, hindi niya binigay yung car. Siguro kailangan niya din. Nasa matinding pangangailangan din. Ano yung magiging remedy niya? It would either be, either ha, pili lang kag isa, dili pwede ang duha. First, demand delivery. Pugsun ni mo si snail, no snail, asa naman, i-deliver na. Plus damages, kasi may delayed na doon. May delay na, or nahasol na ka. Or, demand the court rescission plus damages. Pag sinabi natin rescission, ibabalik kung ano yung na-receive ng isa. Okay? You return what you have received plus damages. Okay? Yan yung magiging remedy kapag hindi nag-comply yung isa. That is 1191. Dito naman sa 1192, in case both parties committed a breach, okay, silang dalawa may pagkukulang. The liability of the first shall equitably tempered by the courts. So, kung unsa tong liability sa isa, mura ra pug i-offset dito sa liability sa isa. Kung dili mahibalan, kung kinsa gyud una nga naka-violate, then the same shall be deemed extinguished. Ay, oy, kalibog ba? Dili man mahibalan kung kinsa sa inyo ang una nagpabaya. Then sige, wala na lay obligation. And then kung unsa man yung mga damages, hala, magkanya-kanya na lang magbayad, ana. Okay? You bear your own damages. Pareho naman kayong guilty sa breach eh. Hindi, bahala na kayo. Walay maningil sa isa kay pariharaman mo makasasala, 'di ba? And the contract now will be extinguished. So, wala nang magiging obligation. All right? So that's for 1192. The whole thing, yun yung pure and conditional obligations. So, hindi na pala natin napag-usapan ng obligations with a period, no? Ang oras nato is 11:32. I still have parang daghan-daghan pa ni siya. Okay, definition of term span, etc. Okay, para dali, adtuan na lang nato ni. And then I will leave the reading to you. Okay, ako man po i-post ang material. Unsay kalahian sa condition o period? Okay, humanata sa conditional obligation, we're now in obligations with a period. This is very important. You should know the difference between the two. Pag sinabi natin condition, sinabi ko to kanina, in-emphasize ko to, uncertain, hindi natin alam na mangyayari. Pero pag sinabi natin period, we are certain na mangyayari. For example, until you die. Okay? Hindi natin alam kung kailan ka mamamatay, pero alam natin mamamatay ka. Okay? That is a period. Or pag sinabi ko, babayaran kita or magbibigay ako sa iyo ng 1,000 per month until December 2022. Okay? Future, December 2022, and certain. Sure naman tayong dadating si December 2022, right? Okay? That is a period, hindi yun condition. Alright? Huwag tayong mabola. Okay? And, pag sinabing condition, pwedeng future or past but unknown. Pero pag sinabi natin period, dapat future lang. Okay? Deadline ba? Murag deadline or ultimatum or tanning. Mo na ginayon na period. It affects the existence. So, pag sinabing condition, dili pa ta sure, di ba? 50-50 pa ta kung madayon ba ang obligation or dili. Sa period, naa na ang obligation. Sure na ta nga naa. It's just that, kanus-a man siya demandable, kanus-a man nato siya mapaningil, or hangtod kanus-a. Okay? Kanus-a nato mapaningil, that's suspensive period. Or hangtod kanus-a until when, that's resolutory period. Okay? So, sure na ta nga na ang obligation, dili pareha sa condition, 50-50 pa. Pag mahitabo ang condition, then yes, naay obligation. Pero pag dili mahitabo ang condition, then wala ding obligation. Another thing, we talked about suspensive condition at the will of the debtor is void, but in the period, if it is in the will of the debtor, it is valid. Retroactive, okay? Pareha ka ganina sa sale of land. It's as if tag-iya siya sa land or naa siya right over the land on the day kung kanusta sila nag-agree, that is on January 20. But in the period, wala po tayong pag-uusapang retroactive. Bakit? Hindi na siya magre-retroact kasi we're talking here about future event lang naman. Okay? So, example sa period. I think we have examples here. Okay, ayan. Next Sunday. Okay? Future and certain. That's the period. Ang condition, future and uncertain. Alright? Ito, certain. Alam nating mangyayari, alam nating darating yung next Sunday na yan. Alam nating mangyayari or darating si 2022 na taon. Alam nating mamamatay ka, hindi nga lang natin alam kung kailan, pero sure tayong dadating yan. Okay? That's a period. Okay? Dili ta ma-confuse, alright? Kung unsa ang condition, unsa ang period. So, tanungin mo muna. Pag sinabing, okay, bibigyan kita ng pera hanggang sa makagraduate ka. Is it a period or a condition? It's a condition. Bakit? Hindi naman natin alam kung gagraduate ka ba. 'Di ba? Or, bibigyan kitang pera hantod sa maminyo ka. Hindi naman tayo sure kung magminyo bagid ka. Okay? Unlike pag sinabi kong, bibigyan kitang pera hanggat sa mamatay ka. Sure tayo mamamatay ka. Sooner or later, hindi nga lang natin alam kung kailan. Bibigyan kitang pera 5 years from now. Okay? Meron tayong period. Alam natin kung kailan matatapos ang 5 years from now. So, that's a period. Alright? So, magkaiba, condition, period. I think wala na tayong time. It's 5:36 sa akin. So, hindi rin natin natapos yung discussion. I think we're gonna have our quiz next time. Anyway, pangutana, may mga tanong po ba?